Welcome to A Peek at the News Shelf, brought to you by Casa Grande Library in Casa Grande, Arizona. I am at the Vista Grande branch. We are going to be reading Open House by Katie Sise, if I am pronouncing that right, published by A Little New York. Chapter 1, Haley, 1 week later. Haley McCullen stared down at Susie's dead body. She tapped her gloved fingertips against Susie's cold, white-blue skin. Tap, tap, tap. 1, 2, 3. The tapping was a compulsion Haley had developed to cope with the waves of sadness and oppressive thoughts about her sister Emma. Haley mostly tapped her right index finger against her left hand and counted. Sometimes she tapped objects that felt interesting to touch, the edge of a staple, or the scratchy fabric on the old armchair where she studied, or Susie even. If she was in public, she tried to conceal her compulsions. If she was alone, she closed her eyes and soaked up the sensations of the tapping. Haley had been doing it for nearly 10 years, ever since her older sister vanished at age 21. And it worked, actually. Every time fury swelled inside her, the tapping calmed her body until she could function again. Fury was the most succinct word to describe it. But it wasn't only anger. It was a surge of regret, despair, and so many other things she didn't dare name, followed by a quickening of her heart and a thick swirl of blood in her ears. It was where her body went every time she thought of Emma. That morning, as Haley tapped Susie's shoulder, tap, 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 1, 2, 3, her mind went to the clavicle and scapula that lay beneath, and she tried not to think about the things the young woman had done when she was alive. But she couldn't always help it. Had Susie used this shoulder to pitch a ball? Haley guessed the odds were that yes, at some point she had. So she imagined Susie's slight frame in a softball uniform, her skeleton of bones very much erect and alive, a sly smile playing on her lips as she considered her batter. Would she be wearing lipstick? No. Haley's mind quickly canceled that out. But her hair, it would be a ponytail most likely. Haley could see it now, trailing over the delicate curve of her spine. Tap, tap, tap. Hello, Susie. It wasn't Susie lying there dead that had Haley so worked up that she needed to tap. It was the phone call she received on her way to her Saturday morning anatomy lab. This has to be a fake. This must be a prank, she thought as Detective Hank Rappaport introduced himself. After assuring her there hadn't been any kind of emergency, he asked in a raspy voice, "Could you come down to the station later this afternoon, Miss McCullen?" Of course she had told him, because that was the only appropriate response to a question like that. And ever since his call, she had only been able to think of Emma, her body like a live wire as she wondered why a detective was calling her in. Susie's toes were painted, and she was pretty too. Maybe it was wrong to notice her cadaver's looks, but Haley felt Susie was different, special even. And not just because of how much she reminded Haley of her disappeared sister, but because Susie and Haley were both in their mid-20s, and each had small tattoos on their ankles. Haley sensed they'd be friends if Susie were alive. But maybe that was taking it too far. She was just on edge lately. People had warned Haley medical school would do this to her. Every day after class, she raced down the University of Yarrow's halls, dying to get to the bathroom so she could scrub her hands, her dry, red fingers never feeling clean enough. Observe the aortic arch, their anatomy teacher, Dr. Brad Aarons, was saying, his voice echoing through the lab. Call me Brad had told them all at the start of the semester, and they did. 20 cadavers lay on stainless steel tables across the room, and the overhead lights were as bright as an operating room. They'd already sawed through the sternum and cracked open the rib cage, and now they were following the ascending aorta as it became the aortic arch and looped over the heart to become the descending aorta. That first day in anatomy, when Haley had been assigned to cadaver station number 4, she gasped when she pulled the sheet from the body and saw the resemblance of Emma. Perfectly pale skin, high cheekbones, long lashes, and a top lip with a cupid's bow. She'd glanced up at Brad and raised her hand as if to protest the match, but then lowered it, feeling utterly ridiculous. What would she even say? She renamed cadaver number 347 Susie to humanize her, and as the first weeks of the semester wore on, there was this part of Haley, and she knew how damaged she was to even think this way, that relished the similarities. She looked for her sister everywhere. Why not here too? Identify each branch, Brad went on, changing the picture on the screen so that it showed a simulation of a gorgeous pulsing heart. Haley loved the human body. She always had. She cut around the brachiocephalic artery, carefully moving aside tissue to expose its course, losing herself in the dissection. She didn't look up again until Brad said, "Eyes here a moment," and changed the slide to an illustration of the heart, the veins and arteries curving in bright reds and blues. Brad Aarons was a cardiothoracic surgeon at the end of his fellowship at Waverly Memorial Hospital. He was somewhere in his late 30s, and half the female students fawned over him, but Haley had no interest in that. He'd been teaching at the University of Yarrow ever since he graduated from its medical school, and Haley didn't know much else about him except that he was married to a woman named Priya, who had once been a successful artist. Note the way the brachiocephalic artery splits into the right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery, Brad was saying. His messy red-blonde hair was an inch too long and a shade lighter than the stubble blanketing his face, but even doctors could get away with a messy look in a town like Waverly because here they valued ideas, academia, and compost piles. Maybe it was because the university hovering on the wooded outskirts, but Waverly didn't preoccupy itself with the kinds of things most wealthy New York City commuter towns did, and Haley wasn't sure whether that made it any better or worse. Elitism was still elitism, even when you packaged it as being smart and noble. As Haley moved on to the right subclavian artery, she thought about how much her sister would have hated this class. Haley would have barfed at least a dozen times by now. She probably wouldn't have even liked to know the cadavers existed on Yarrow's campus when she went to school here. But even though there wasn't a scientific bone in Emma's body, and she never would have taken one of Brad's classes, Haley was sure Brad knew exactly who Emma was and who she was too. The sister of the undergrad who went missing. Everyone knew. Haley remembered the way Brad's eyebrows lifted when he read her name aloud the first day in class, and the way he had taken off the black reading glasses to glance up at her face, searching it for similarities. She knew he'd found the similarities when his eyes widened and part of her enjoyed it. Emma's sister. If she was anything, it was that. Brad tried to cover up the awkwardness by quickly resuming his roll call, barking out names, taking a few moments to get back on track. He'd been weird with her ever since, but that was nothing new. So many people were. Emma went missing her junior year in Yarrow when Haley was a sophomore at Waverly High School. There was no official explanation for her disappearance. The police had closed the case after investigating for months. Interviewing everyone who was at the party that night in the woods with Emma and sweeping the river. Never a guarantee to find the body that way, they kept reminding Haley and her parents. They never did find Emma's body, and they were convinced, just like most people at Waverly, that Emma flung herself into the river from the cliffs behind Yarrow where she was last seen. But Haley knew in her bones that that was impossible. Haley had her dark side, but she wasn't suicidal. Haley believed Emma had been killed and that the police were too naive to figure it out, and once she realized her theories were falling on deaf ears in Waverly, including the police department, she had to get out of there. She chose Stanford for college, far away from the dark and cold East Coast that had claimed her sister, and a plane flight from her parents who were trying so hard to keep it together. At the airport, Haley's parents warned her over and over to stay safe, but their warnings were hollow. Emma's disappearance made it too obvious that they didn't have control over anything. It didn't take long for Haley to realize that California had been a mistake. She missed her parents. She felt too removed from Waverly and where she had lost Emma. Some magical part of her was certain she was the only one who could get to the bottom of her sister's disappearance. So after undergrad, Haley moved back to the east, to New York City, to be closer to her parents. That's where she met Dean, her fiancé, the only person besides her mother who had ever believed her theories that her sister had been killed by someone who was at the party that night. Her own father was convinced Emma might have just run away or been taken alive, and even Haley's friends at Stanford had nodded along when she got drunk enough to talk about Emma, clearly feeling sorry for her, but also seeming not to believe her. "You're too close to see things clearly," one of her roommates had said late one night. And Haley wondered if she didn't use the right language. Disappeared, missing, dead. Words Haley used interchangeably about what could have happened to her sister that night, the truth existing somewhere in the dark spaces between them. Dean had supported Haley when she accepted an offer from Yarrow's medical school, and now here they were, back in Waverly, where it all started. Haley knew it was crazy to want to live in a town she'd grown up, where her parents still lived, and to walk the campus where they'd experienced their worst nightmare. But her grief was like a part of her body now, and she felt a visceral need to stay connected to her roots and her pain and to her sister. Haley looked down at the slim platinum ring she could just make out beneath her rubber gloves. An engagement. Dean had proposed a few months ago, and Haley knew something needed to change if she was supposed to start a new family. Because how could she move forward when the person she loved could be stuck, buried somewhere underground, her disappearance still a mystery?